For a change of pace, today we're going to look at a video. I don't do that too often. It's called The Willful Unreasonable Doubt of Atheists.
Atheists are trolls, mostly.
I willfully choose to doubt that accusation, sir. I have never trolled anyone in my entire life.
I mean, these are people who, identify as smart people.
Not that common in my experience, but I think probably what you're referring to is the tendency of people to talk about things like rationality or logic as the reason that they're holding their positions. You'll have some person calling himself, the rational atheist, or myself calling myself Logicked, although that actually had nothing originally to do with atheism. And I would suggest that if you use a name like that, or you talk about rational thinking or whatever, that you're not identifying yourself as a smart person, because rational thinking, reason, logic, these are not the same thing as being smart. They're techniques, they're ways that you can approach a question, and dumb people can do them too. Certain people might find it a little bit easier or a little bit harder to learn how to do this stuff and to apply it. But to say that you value these things is not equivalent to declaring yourself smart, or at least it shouldn't be. Now, you see this kind of stuff popping up with anyone. A couple big examples relevant to my channel are Stand to Reason, run by Greg Kokel, who I've responded to numerous times, and featuring Tim Barnett, who I've also responded to numerous times, and who has a spin-off channel called Red Pen Logic. But I will concede that on YouTube, at least, if you see something like rational or reason or logic in relation to the God question, more likely than not, that's an atheist. And I don't think that's a declaration of, I'm smart. Usually, anyway. If it's a declaration of anything, I think it's much more a declaration of, I choose to set aside those things that so often bias the way people look at religion. Things like their emotional investment in the story of Jesus, or their wish to live forever, or their fear of hell or ostracism, or even just habit. This is what I've been told my entire life. I choose to set all of that aside and look at this question just through reason, through rationally considering the information and taking things to their logical conclusions. It's not a declaration of intelligence, it's a declaration of intent. Now, whether you think they live up to this or not is up to you. You might say they try at this and fail, or you might say they're lying about trying at all. I don't know what you want to say about this. I just don't think that they self-identify as smart is really a fair characterization, that's all.
And somehow, they've tricked people into playing along and treating them like smart people.
Tricked what people? Other atheists? Or Christians who engage in debates with them? I don't know, I'll have to wait and see what you're talking about there. Who are you talking to? Who's back there behind the camera? Nobody. The answer is nobody, right? Basically every video on your channel in the past few months is like this. This fake interview format. You act like someone's interviewing you even though nobody's there. And then now you've started color correcting it so that it looks like it's filmed in the 1970s. Maybe to give it an air of historical importance. Look guys, I found this documentary from 1976 and this guy says atheists are idiots. I guess that's the intention, but the effect is that it looks like you just don't know where the camera lens is. Like you've mistaken some spot on your wall for the camera. And so I find it really comical. I'm over here. Talk to me. Why are you looking over there?
It's the definition of futile for a religious person, and certainly for a Muslim, to abuse any moment of their time engaged in the charade of debate or discussion with an atheist.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. It's a waste of your time, okay? Coming up with terrible arguments and smearing them all over the internet, it's a complete waste. Defending your ideas, total waste. You all can stop now.
Trying to convince them of what's obvious.
Right, exactly. It's obvious. Everybody thinks it's obvious. We're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, or whatever Muslims say that's equivalent. I'm sure there's something. So stop it. For the love of God, stop it.
When their whole identity is built around denying the obvious because they think it makes them smart to do that.
Why would denying the obvious make you smart? I mean, jokes aside, you must realize that other people might not always think that the things that you think are obvious as you think. But let's say they do. Does something being perceived as obvious by a person put it beyond question? Well, I would argue no. I would argue that there are many things throughout history that people have considered to be obvious, things that everyone knows, which turned out to be plainly wrong. The Earth is flat. The Earth is at the center of the universe. The four elements, the four humors, spontaneous generation, astrology, or even things like a chair is a solid, unambiguously definable object. The list goes on essentially forever, and I'm sure that if you think about it, you can come up with some examples more applicable to modern times, to suit your taste, of people believing that some idea is so obvious as to scarcely require any justification, and certainly obvious enough to put it beyond question. I would argue that when somebody says, this is so obvious you don't need to ask questions about it, that's a good sign that maybe it deserves to have some questions asked about it. If its truth really is so blindingly obvious, then any question you can ask about it should contribute to establishing that. But on the other hand, if it only seems obviously true, but in fact isn't actually true, that's worth knowing. Either way, it's at least worth considering. Now, of course, I'm not saying that what you should do when you encounter a so-called obvious truth is deny it. To unquestioningly deny is the same as to unquestioningly affirm. I'm just saying that if we want to avoid being wrong too often, maybe it's a good idea to look at things that we think are obviously true and say, okay, it feels obvious, but is it actually as true as we feel that it is? And in what way? And what does that mean?
Not to mention, when you have Muslims or religious people engaging with someone who is an atheist as a career, a professional atheist.
Professional atheist? What a silly superstition. How could you do this, that, as a career?
Whose job it is to willfully not be convinced.
That's an interesting question. Is my job to willfully not be convinced? Well, I'm not sure about the willfully part, but I suppose that if I suddenly found myself convinced of the claims of the religious through, some brilliant apologetics video where the arguments somehow don't suck, and I decided in that video to convert to, say, Islam, yeah, I probably would have some career issues, put it that way. This, of course, applies just as much, if not more so, to anyone who preaches Christianity or Islam for a living. Their job is to willfully not be convinced by arguments of atheists or people from other religions, and to willfully be convinced by people of their own religion. If we're characterizing all of this as willfully engaging in this way, which I'm not convinced of, willfully or otherwise. But I guess the real question is, does this mean anything important with regard to the sincerity of these people? Atheists who make money through discussing atheism on the internet, like me? Priests and imams and apologists and so on who make their living from discussing their points of view? If somebody discusses a point of view that they claim to hold and makes money doing it, is that a reason for us to assume insincerity? I would argue actually it's the other way around. I would argue that most of the time, when you see someone who's dedicated an enormous amount of their time to talking about a particular position on a subject, that person is very likely sincere. In fact, that person very likely got into that position in the first place through being sincere about it. You don't just fall into this by accident, usually. I'll put it to you this way, when I started, I didn't make anything doing this, but I did it anyway. Now, I guess you could come up with some situation in which a person would continue to do it for the money without actually being sincere. And this is a real phenomenon. For example, look at the Clergy Project. It's an organization set up to help people whose job is to preach religion, but who have ceased to believe in the religion, which is a pretty unenviable position when you think about it. If you've got yourself a mortgage and kids to support and you rely on a certain amount of income and that's the only thing that you're qualified for, it's not necessarily so easy to just quit, or even just to be honest with your community about what you really think. So this is a phenomenon in religion, and of course it's also possible that an atheist could be in the same position. It's possible that tomorrow I could be convinced of the existence of God and find myself stuck between a rock and a hard place. But you're talking about this as if simply making money from talking implies insincerity about that of which you speak, which just doesn't seem realistic to me. I think that for every insincere atheist talking on the internet, or in debates or whatever, or every secretly deconverted Muslim or Christian leader, there are probably a significant number who are sincere, who are there because they're sincere. I find it very strange to assert otherwise because that seems to imply that if anyone takes money at any point, we should discount what they have to say and treat them as if they're lying, which I would think would ultimately be a much bigger problem for religion than for atheism.
An atheist is like that one juror, on the jury, who just for the sake of being awkward is like,
Supposing we're wrong.
Supposing we're wrong. Supposing this whole building should fall down on my head, you can suppose anything.
Okay, I added the clip, but are you seriously suggesting that the only reason a juror on a jury might be the only one to disagree is to be awkward? Or as you said before, to act smart?
You're a pretty smart fella, aren't you?
11 people disagree with him. How could he possibly be sincere?
11 men in here think he's guilty. No one had to think about it twice except you.
Just because the defendant was caught covered in the victim's blood, holding the murder weapon, standing over the victim's body and carrying a notebook in his pocket, that detailed how he was going to carry out the crime and how he was going to stab the victim to death, that doesn't mean he's guilty.
Very conveniently thorough fantasy case you've developed there. Now, of course, it's true that even in a case like that, there are alternative explanations that may be worth considering. The world is a complicated place, and the sheer variety and number of murder cases means that sometimes you're going to get a case where, yes, on the surface, everything seems to line up, and it looks for all the world like the guy really should go to jail, but some detail comes along that throws the whole thing off. This is why sometimes you get people released 30 years later on DNA evidence or something like that. To act like the only possible reason to ask questions about this case is to be awkward is also basically to argue that in cases where the prosecution has a lot of evidence, there's no need for a defense. Because why would you defend this obviously guilty person except just to be awkward? Now, in my opinion, as applied to supernatural claims, this is not a good analogy. I'm sure you believe it is, but from my perspective, this is much more akin to a court case where the prosecution comes in and says the defendant isn't here because we haven't found him yet. We're confident he exists. That seems obvious. We know that he was covered in the victim's blood. We know that he was holding the murder weapon. We know he was standing over the body and carrying a notebook that told all of his nefarious plans, and he's 6'13" and made of milk. So let's get this guy convicted. I gotta get home for lunch, and we'll bring him in here, at some point. Obviously, you're not gonna like that comparison. Obviously, you're gonna say, it's obvious, you're just being an awkward juror. Okay, call me all the names you want, I don't care. That's still what it is from my perspective.
We weren't there when it happened. I didn't witness the crime myself.
And this is what you say atheists say, or the awkward juror who represents the atheists in the analogy. That's not what atheists say. That's what young earth creationists say. Typically, you won't hear atheists saying things like that, because we understand how evidence works.
You'd actually have to bring the victim back to life and have the defendant murder the victim in front of me, and then maybe I can be sure that he's guilty. Otherwise, it's just conjecture, biased interpretation of evidence. It's preposterous.
I genuinely do not understand how you think this is describing atheists. I mean, from the start of this video, your objection was atheists don't accept God just being obvious. So this is more like if the prosecution came in and said, yeah, that guy's guilty, it's obvious. And then the judge said, okay, jury, off to the jury room, make your decision. And then 11 people in the jury room go, yeah, that guy said it was obvious, it's really obvious. And the one awkward guy goes, wait, why? Why is it obvious? I don't find this obvious at all. What are you guys seeing that I'm not? Can you explain it to me?
I just think he's guilty. I thought it was obvious from the word go. I mean, nobody proved otherwise.
And they think that they're being intelligent.
It doesn't matter what I'm being. If I'm being intelligent, if I'm being stupid, it's really all beside the point. The point is that you say something that to me seems nonsensical and totally unsupported by anything I would consider to even approach a good reason. If you had evidence on the level of the evidence you described in that courtroom of the guy covered in blood with the notebook and all that, we would be having a very different conversation. And hey, what do I know? Maybe you do have evidence on that level, but all the religious people have been withholding it from me my entire life. The religious people and their gods. It's possible. I don't deny that possibility. But if I am not provided with something that actually convinces me, then I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. I can't join you. I can't just adopt your position for no reason. It's not going to happen. If it turns out I'm the biggest idiot on the planet for not getting this information the way you do, for not reaching the conclusion that you do, or for just not having access to the information that you do, so be it. I can't believe you without being convinced that you're right first. That's not being intelligent. That's just being a person. You can't believe and not believe in the same way at the same time.
They're committed to fabricating reasonable doubt, even if it's unreasonable to everyone but them.
Could they be wrong?
What are you trying to say? Those people sat on the stand under oath.
They're only people. People make mistakes. Could they be wrong?
Well, no, I don't think so.
You know so.
Look, yes, you find it unreasonable to have doubts. Bizarrely enough, billions of people agree with you. And if it wasn't just billions of people, if it was everyone on the planet but me, I would still have doubts. Now, what exactly is the problem here? Is it just that I ask questions and that makes you uncomfortable? Are you uncomfortable with the fact that there's not total conformity on this question? Do you just think I'm stupid for not leaping to your preferred conclusion as if I think it's as obvious as you do, without so much as considering the claim or the information or anything first? Whatever the problem is for you, I'm sorry that it's a problem for you. For whatever that's worth, I guess.
I mean, just by the principle of Occam's razor, which they like, God exists. God is the simplest and most obvious explanation for existence. for the universe, for creation.
Yeah, but see, that's the problem, is that just because you can say it in a small number of words, that doesn't make it the simplest explanation. I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but just in terms of the number of entities proposed. If you say the universe is all there is, it's eternal, its state changes over time, but it's always been there, that's significantly simpler than if you say the universe is not all there is, there's this entire other aspect of reality external to the universe, with a personality and a will that created the universe. That's significantly less simple. Yes, it's simple to say the words, God did it, but the simplicity of ideas isn't defined by how simple it is just to express them. Regardless, though, Occam's razor is not the be-all and end-all of all thinking. Sure, it's a useful heuristic, but that doesn't mean that's all we focus on. Otherwise, going back to the idea of a criminal trial, if there were a couple who occasionally argued, and she ended up dead, and the husband was found beside her body with the murder weapon in his hand, we would just toss him immediately into prison for life, even if there was some evidence that somebody might have broken into the house, perhaps to rob the place, and the husband insists that, in fact, there was a robber in the house who killed his wife. Nope, he was beside the body and he had the weapon, so life in prison it is, no further investigation required, because it's simpler that the husband just killed his wife. That's one of the most common situations in which people kill each other. There's a history of at least verbal conflict between the two, and there's a direct connection of the husband to the crime scene. Plus, it doesn't posit an unknown third party. But obviously, this would be an insane way to run a justice system, because this is an insane way to make any decision with finality generally. Yeah, the detectives would be well advised to consider the husband as a suspect, and to look very carefully into him. But that's not the end of the case. Occam's razor is a rule of thumb. That doesn't mean you just compare relative simplicity and then stop. It's how you figure out where to start, not where to stop.
So you have to justify why this obvious explanation isn't true.
Well, my entire career is based on showing why the reasons people think it's so obvious and so true don't hold up. And based on that work, from my perspective, it doesn't look very obvious or very true. It doesn't have any of the hallmarks of either of those things. Could it still be true? Sure, why not? But there's not a whole lot leaning me towards that conclusion. But that's really beside the point as far as the burden of proof goes. The fact is, I don't have time to sit around and evaluate literally every random thing people tell me. I couldn't even count the number of different things people have told me and then insisted are obviously true. If you really think your thing is super special and super important, what you're going to have to do is get my attention, get me interested, and then convince me that it is as obvious and as true as you're convinced that it is. This is why in court, even if the prosecution and the defense and the judge and everybody in the room thinks the conclusion is obvious, they still need to get a jury and get the jury into the jury box and talk to them, or at least talk in their presence, about what explanation is being proposed, why it's being proposed, what the evidence for it is, even if they think it's the most obvious thing in the world that the guy killed his wife. It's not good enough to look at the jury and say, hey, jury, you have to justify why the obvious explanation isn't true. That's not their job. If you're invested in other people being convinced of the things that you say, it's your job to do it. If you don't want to do that job, well, fine. And that's where my jokes at the start of the video come back. I can't wait to never hear another crappy argument for why somebody thinks this thing is true. People have been trying to convince me for so long, and they've only made me less convinced, because from my perspective, their arguments are really that bad. And if it's gotten to the point where you find this so frustrating that certain people in this world just won't accept what you say just because you say it's obvious, then stop. Give up. Take the L. That's fine. It's okay. You can do that. Every religious person is more than welcome to do that. And that appears to be what you at least are doing. So, okay.
You have to convince me of why there has to be some other convoluted, fantastical explanation for existence.
No. For one thing, I don't care if you believe there's a God. Go ahead and believe there's a God. I have no interest in convincing you otherwise. I just want to know why you think I should be convinced there is one. But either way, why do you think that that's how explanations work? Like, for example, what if tomorrow I proved definitively that we were wrong this entire time and, in fact, atoms don't exist? That every observation we made that indicated atoms was just some sort of a glitch in the equipment? Would I have to replace atomic theory with something else for this to be a viable conclusion? Well, no, I don't think so. I think that you can falsify one idea without replacing it with another. I would say that's kind of a required feature. If I found that fabled rabbit fossil in Precambrian rock, that would falsify evolution. Would that mean I would have to have some replacement for evolution ready to go immediately? Well, no. Another point on this is that this is all assuming that the approach that I take is to first convince you that God does not exist, and then I convince you that some other explanation that you think is more complicated belongs in its place. But what if instead I just showed you that the explanation that you think is more complicated is in fact not as complicated? That wouldn't require disproving God. It wouldn't even require demonstrating the other possibility, because apparently the way we're making decisions is just, is it simpler according to my interpretation of Occam's razor? Yes, therefore it's true. So in fact, apparently all that actually needs to be shown for you to deconvert is that there's at least one alternative explanation that's simpler than God. That's a significantly lower bar than just demonstrating to you that God doesn't exist at all. But all this is really just pointless chatter because I'm not going to do any of this. You want me convinced. It doesn't go the other way. This whole video is just you being butthurt that some people don't instantly believe you.
Just like in a criminal case, you have to come up with some plausible explanation for why the overwhelming evidence does not lead to the obvious conclusion.
Yeah, if there's overwhelming evidence that you're guilty, then your defense team's probably going to have a bit of a challenge on their hands because they will have to demonstrate why that evidence doesn't point to you being guilty. What evidence are we talking about with relation to God? Because most of what I hear is stuff like this. Stuff like, well, it's obvious. It's just obvious. There are a few that are a little more involved, but still fail. But for the most part, what you're giving me in this video is the evidence for God. At least as far as I've ever heard.
Because look, again, like in a court case, the fact of the matter is that guilt or innocence is impossible to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. Any half-decent lawyer will tell you that.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt? Yeah, I agree. Beyond a shadow of a doubt is a foolish standard. It's not one that I hold at all. Not for this or anything else. When I say things like, if you want me to believe in God, then convince me, I'm not looking for beyond a shadow of a doubt. At this point, I'm not even looking for beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm not even looking for beyond 50% or beyond 25%. I'm looking for anything that will make me even start taking this idea seriously. Because I haven't heard anything. And that's the problem that you have. You're standing in a courtroom with a piece of paper that just says, it's obvious, it's obvious, it's obvious, it's obvious, it's obvious, it's obvious. And the jury's looking at you and rolling their eyes because what the hell is this guy doing? How is this supposed to work?
An attorney's job is to tell a story using available evidence as props. And whoever can come up with the most plausible and the most convincing story based on that evidence, or the interpretation of that evidence, will win the case.
Okay, so let's imagine this courtroom then. You've got the prosecution, that's the God side, the people who are trying to prove their case, and you've got the defense, who I guess in this case are atheists who tend to argue against the quality of theistic arguments. And the prosecution says, okay, here's my evidence. The universe just in general is complicated. Therefore, God did it. And the atheist side is like, wait, hold on a second. Why is that the answer? And the theist side is like, why are you so awkward? Why are you denying the obvious? And the atheist side goes, what an unusual response. Okay, well, anyway, you wanted explanations other than God for some of the complexity in the universe, right? I'm not really that interested in this. I'm more interested in why you think it's this God thing, but it seems you're interested, so here's a stack of science stuff. You could start with that. And the theist's like, no. None of that matters, because no matter what explanation you give, it's still God. So the atheist goes, okay, well, come back to me when you got something better than heads I win, tails you lose, because this is pretty stupid right now.
The prosecutor interprets the evidence to prove guilt, and the defense attorney interprets the evidence to cast doubt about that guilt.
Right, so the prosecution runs through a whole big list of reasons why we should believe God did it, and at every step the defense is listening to those reasons and then providing reasons of their own, why the prosecution's reasons don't hold up and in fact in many cases aren't even internally consistent, and the rest of them are just based on shrugs and bald, unsupported assertions.
And when all of the evidence leads to an obvious conclusion, the defense attorney really has to earn his money. That's when he has to get creative.
Okay, so in our courtroom scenario, we have the prosecution's story, which is the universe is complicated. I don't know how to explain that. Therefore, it was a transcendent being outside space and time that decided to create the universe. And then we have the defense's story, which is that story from the prosecution appears to be based on not much of anything, other than some arguments that don't appear to hold up under scrutiny. And it kind of seems like the prosecution is just jamming whatever they like wherever they like, with no actual justification for doing so. And at this point, I feel like this courtroom analogy is getting really strained, and it wasn't really that useful from the start, so I don't know why we're still doing it. I think the overall point is you make arguments and people like me go, I don't really buy it, and then you're sad and you want to take your ball and go home. I think we'd do better sticking on that point, because this whole comparison of human interaction and of one person convincing another person of something doesn't really benefit from being mangled into fitting an analogy like this.
But that's why in the legal system, it's the phrase isn't actually beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Because there's usually only one story that's actually plausible. There's usually actually only one interpretation of evidence that's believable.
Right, believable, able to be believed. This is why before I compared the atheists to the people in the jury, not to the defense, because they're the ones who have to decide if your story is believable to them. Now, of course, you think your story is believable. You think that you saying the universe is complicated, therefore God did it, is so believable, so overwhelmingly, obviously believable, that anyone who doesn't immediately accept it must just be unreasonable. I understand this, and I'm sure that the prosecution in real trials often feels this way as well. That anyone on the jury who wouldn't find this story believable, who wouldn't find this interpretation of the evidence believable, is just being unreasonable. But that does not preclude the prosecution from being wrong. The prosecution might be someone like you who thinks he's the most brilliant guy in the room and couldn't possibly be wrong, that all of his arguments are perfect, that anyone who isn't convinced must be a fucking idiot, who in fact thinks that his unquestionable correctness was handed down to him from God himself. And yet, the prosecution can be wrong.
And that's how normal thinking people operate. That's what actual intelligent people do. Genuinely smart people do not insist on the validity of outlandish doubts and contrived alternative explanations when clear-cut explanations are plain to see and are accepted by the majority of people.
Yes. Keep stroking your ego about how smart you are, about how you're the smartest person in the world, because you look around at explanations and try to figure out which one is the simplest and most popular, and just go with that. Yes, you're a super genius. I'm sure this works out perfectly for you in every situation. Yeah.
Being needlessly, pointlessly, absurdly contrarian is not a sign of intellect.
I agree. Obviously, I don't think that's what everyone who ever questions you is doing, but I guess what's the point in me saying that anymore? I'm kind of just repeating the obvious here. And smart people accept the obvious stuff. No, you're not the smart people, I'm the smart people. No, you're not the smart people, I'm the smart people. No, you're not the smart people, I'm the smart people.
It's a sign of someone who uses their intellect just to be needlessly and pointlessly absurd. And that's atheists. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you're silly enough to engage with atheists on their terms and to debate with them on their terms, then it's like you're agreeing to play football, you're agreeing to play soccer in a marsh, in a swamp, just because they tell you that it's actually a football field and we're going to play by the rules.
Yes, we're back to the sentiment from the start of the video. I completely agree. You should believe this. Teach your friends this. That's what you've done. Thank you very much. You can all get all mopey and take your ball and go home. The prosecution can stomp out of the courtroom in a huff because why should I have to demonstrate my case? It's obvious. And you can all go over there and be proud of yourself about how smart you are for winning the football game or the court case or whatever it is that you ran away from. And the rest of us can just, well, for one thing, get on with our lives, but for another thing, continue to dismantle your now entirely undefended position. I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish, but I don't have a problem with it. So thank you for this video, and thank you everybody for watching. If you would be so kind, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't. If you really like the channel, maybe consider supporting. A couple bucks per video or per month helps a huge amount. An enormous thanks to all of my supporters who've already made that choice. Early access, email list, list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.